Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into deep, a deep philosophical challenge that's kind of disguised as a book.
Right.
It's titled The Two Within: Ego, Spirit, and the Question of Who You Are. It's by Jimmy Perez, came out in 2026.
Hmm.
And this is not, your typical self-help book. It really feels more like an invitation to confront what is maybe the single most fundamental tension in our
It
existence.
really is.
The self we believe we are, the one that's kind of fragmented and frankly fearful, versus the self we actually are, which he says is whole and eternal.
And that's the critical distinction he makes right from the start. Perez isn't writing this to hand you a new set of answers.
Yeah.
He's trying to provide a mirror, a really detailed, insightful mirror. The whole mission, and he says this in the preface, is just so profoundly simple. It's an invitation to stop looking outward for fulfillment and finally start looking inward.
And he uses contrast to do that.
Constantly, polar opposites, this inner tension, light and shadow. But the point isn't to create a battleground inside you.
Right. It's not about good versus evil in that simplistic way.
No, not at all. It's to deepen your understanding through recognition. By putting the human experience right next to this divine essence, he helps you, the reader, realize this immense inherent power that you already have inside you. It's already there. The book is, he calls it a roadmap for remembrance.
What makes it so compelling, and this is what we're really going to spend a lot of time on today, is his methodology.
Oh, absolutely.
He takes this phrase, truth leaves fingerprints everywhere, and he just turns it into his governing principle.
He does.
He doesn't stick to just one tradition, one spiritual path. He synthesizes sources so aggressively. He's pulling from ancient scripture. He names the Torah, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, all of them. And then he puts that right alongside present moment, awareness, psychology, even modern physics. It's not just comparing religions. This is a deep dive into a kind of cross-cultural synthesis.
Yeah, and the argument is that the same essential message, about this dual nature of reality in the self, it just appears again and again. It's just wrapped in different symbols, different languages across different times.
Thanks.
And he grounds this whole synthesis in one of the most foundational and I think surprisingly overlooked clues about who we are. It comes straight from the book of Exodus.
The moment with Moses.
The moment with Moses, he's questioning his mission and he asks God, "Who shall I say sent me?" And he's expecting a name, right? A title, something external, something authoritative.
Tell them Bob sent you.
Exactly. But the response isn't any of those things. It's just this pure, unadorned declaration of existence. I am. And Perez really, really spends time emphasizing the implication of that.
I remember I had to put the book down at that page. I just paused. He stresses, not he is, not they are. I am. It's so deceptively simple. What does that one ancient declaration actually change about how we approach spirituality?
It changes everything. It completely flips the dynamic of spiritual authority. If the source, the ultimate reality, declares itself as I am, it means that every single time you say those two words, I am, you're not just describing your mood or where you are.
You're echoing something fundamental.
You're echoing the fundamental essence of being itself. You're not pointing outward to some authority figure on a cloud. You're pointing inward to the very core of your own reality. It suggests the whole search has to be an internal one. That declaration, I am, becomes the absolute foundation for understanding this paradox of the two selves operating inside us.
Wow.
And he reminds us that even scriptures that whisper things like ye are gods, they're echoing that same truth. That divine spark isn't somewhere else. It's right here, inside you.
It's fascinating how he then uses that internal reality to reinterpret the whole concept of the Son of Man. Most of us see that through such a narrow, singular lens, but he just blows it wide open.
He really does. He sees the Son of Man as a universal potential, not a singular person. It's the incarnation of the divine expressed through humanity, and we've seen it across history. It's not a role for one man. It's a potential for any man or woman who can embody that full, unfragmented consciousness.
So he's talking to people like Abraham, Moses,
Elijah, Jeremiah, Jesus, Buddha, countless others. Anyone who achieved that level of alignment between the human part of them and the divine part of them.
And he's pretty transparent about his own background here, which I think really helps. It helps bridge that gap between traditional religion and this, kind of radical synthesis he's proposing.
Yes. He says right up front, I come from a Christian background. He holds the Bible as sacred. He believes it carries the word of God. But then he immediately adds this crucial caveat.
Which is?
He doesn't believe it's the only place that word exists. And he doesn't believe the text is untouchable or perfect. He reminds you that just like the Torah, the Upanishads, the Quran, it was written and compiled by men. That fact humanizes it.
It doesn't invalidate it.
Not at all. He says the enduring power comes from the spirit that moved through the authors. The core message is always consistent. God is not contained in a book or a church or even in one single person. God is spirit eternal, infinite, and most importantly, omnipresent. And he really leans on that word. Omnipresent means everywhere, which has to include you.
That sets the stage perfectly for the core framework of the whole book. This is where we get into the two within. This quiet realm inside us where the seen and the unseen meet. This gentle tension, the sacred paradox between the two selves that exist in our consciousness. One born of dust, he says, finite, temporary, subject to decay, and the other born of light, which is eternal and completely unbound.
And this internal friction, this is the engine of the entire human condition. The self born of dust is what he calls the I.
What we would call the ego.
Exactly what modern psychology calls the ego. This self is the voice of your human experience. It's your temporary self navigating a temporary world. It's the seeker, the struggler, the wanderer. And Perez just meticulously details its nature. It's always hungry, perpetually hungry. It wants safety. It wants certainty. It wants a concrete, fixed identity. It desperately aches for belonging and for external approval. It's why we chase titles, possessions, followers.
Right.
This I is terrified of its own impermanence, so it clings to external forms, our names, our roles, our jobs, the fleeting security of the material world. It is, and this is his metaphor, it's trapped in a dense fog, just groping for meaning like a lost child.
And the most defining characteristic of this ego, the one that he says causes the most pain, is its relationship with truth.
Precisely. This is so key. Perez defines the ego as the part that believes but does not know.
What's the difference?
Belief is intellectual. It requires external proof or an external authority figure to tell you what's true. He calls the infant soul navigating eternity, totally bewildered, and often just lashing out in this quiet desperation. It builds defenses, habits, distractions, anything to fill that hollow ache of forgetting who it really is. The ego lives in a state of chronic self-doubt, but it masks it with overconfidence.
But then just beneath that fragile, really noisy surface of the ego, there's the other self, the higher self, or as he calls it, the sacred witness.
This is the divine spark. This is the echo of the I am. It's not constrained by birth or death. It is completely self-sufficient. It doesn't chase anything. It doesn't beg for anything. It doesn't clamor for attention. It's just still, whole, radiant. It simply is.
So where the ego is defined by its needs, by constantly seeking.
The higher self just rests. It rests effortlessly in knowing. It understands that it doesn't need to find a purpose because it is purpose.
Right.
It doesn't beg for love because it is love, unbound and infinite. This higher self, it operates on complete trust even when things are uncertain. The ego's mind, meanwhile, just fears and recoils.
He has that beautiful metaphor for it, the ego builds walls.
The ego builds walls out of fear, whereas the higher self opens windows, allowing light and possibility to just flow in. Where the little I sees fundamental separation everywhere, the higher self only sees union.
The moment you accept this framework, that the divine is actually within you, the entire approach to sacred practices, especially something like prayer, has to change. It just has to.
It requires a complete reorientation. Prayer stops being a petition. It's no longer about asking a deity who's far away to intervene or trying to bargain for a specific outcome.
Right. Please, God, let me win the lottery.
Exactly. It becomes instead a returning inward, a folding in, an intimate act of surrender to the presence that resides in the sanctuary of your own self. This is why so many people find traditional prayer exhausting or, ineffective. They're petitioning a distant entity for something that is already their birthright.
And he reinterprets that common prayer, let thy will be done. That's not a plea of submission, is it? He sees it as something much more powerful.
It is the ultimate act of empowerment, not weakness. It's not a plea to some outside force to take over because we can't handle it. It is a conscious, intentional yielding of the ego, that small, panicked, grasping I, to the higher truth, to the eternal will that is already alive within you. It's surrendering the illusion of control and allowing that divine intelligence to flow through you, instead of trying to micromanage your existence from a place of fear.
He describes this moment of personal breakthrough he had, of touching something ancient but also intimately his own. And that just reinforces this idea that this truth is universal, no matter what you call it.
Yeah, he tells this wonderful story. He recalls a conversation with his uncle, and they were talking about this concept of the internal life force. His uncle pointed out that, while Christianity uses specific terms, every single tradition identifies this inner current. They just use different words and different practices to tap into it,
And they're all pointing to the same thing.
all pointing to the same essence, the divine animating force within. In India, they seek union with it through yoga. In China, they focus on cultivating qi. In Japan, it's known as ki. And he even cites the term from Indonesia, ulan napas, which is all about the sacred breath. The realization is that this sacred blueprint, it wasn't authored by some distant chosen few. It is intrinsic to being alive. It's right here, in all of us, just waiting to be acknowledged.
This understanding leads directly to what I think is maybe the most revolutionary idea in the book, especially about the spiritual journey. It's the difference between just believing something and deeply knowing it. He has this powerful line, belief is borrowed, knowing is born.
This is the core thesis of what genuine awakening is. Belief always implies doubt. It requires you to rely on an external teaching, a pastor, a book, a guru. It's a secondhand source of truth. Knowing, on the other hand, is born when that revelation strikes internally, when the truth echoes in your soul and it becomes undeniable, felt reality.
So true awakening is just remembering.
It's nothing more complicated than remembering what was always there, untouched, just beneath these thick, dusty layers of conditioning and societal expectations and all these fear-based doctrines we're fed.
The pain then, all the suffering we experience, it just stems from that simple act of forgetting, that separation.
Exactly. Suffering is fundamentally rooted in separation, not just from other people, but primarily from the sacred self within. We are conditioned from birth to believe we are inherently broken, sinful, fundamentally unworthy. And this conditioning, it often turns life into this painful waiting room for heaven, rather than allowing us to experience the divinity that's inherent in this very moment.
And to maintain that separation, to keep the ego in the driver's seat, we rely on noise. He argues we just drown that inner voice, that initial innocence, beneath this relentless stream of distraction and consumption and entertainment. We are terrified of silence.
It's such a profound observation about modern life. He says we fear silence not because it's empty, but because it is full.
Full of what?
Full of everything we've been running from. Full of the quiet, undeniable truth of who we really are once you strip away all our roles and labels. That persistent ache that we label as anxiety or depression. He argues it stems from this dissonance, this constant effort to turn away from the presence within. The inner voice never actually leaves. We just try to drown it out with external noise. Healing, he says, starts with this sacred attunement, turning inward so completely that the outer world just fades away, allowing the divine to unfold in the stillness.
It's simple to be silent, but it's not easy.
No, you have to excavate that silence from beneath this enormous inherited mountain of fear and expectation.
That discussion of noise and inner friction, it transitions us perfectly into the next major part of the book, where he turns his gaze outward. He starts to examine the external frameworks that define our spiritual world, specifically his critique of rigid dualism, the classic God versus the devil.
And he is unsparing in his view of this rigid dualism, this idea of a separate, equally powerful God fighting a devil, or absolute good versus absolute evil. He argues this whole narrative is a human construct.
A story we tell ourselves.
A dramatically convenient story we created out of a desperate and, an understandable need to explain suffering and chaos and contradiction. If God is defined as only love and perfection, then we need an external scapegoat, a separate malicious force to be responsible for all the bad stuff. The devil, in this view, is just a mirror of our inner conflict, not a reflection of the universe itself.
But isn't that a dangerous path to go down? I mean, if you get rid of the idea of an external evil force, doesn't that remove the traditional moral compass for a lot of people?
That's a vital question, and he addresses it by trying to clarify the nature of the source itself, rather than defining morality based on fear of some cosmic rival. His point is that we limit ourselves, we diminish the sheer magnitude of the source by falling into what he calls gross anthropomorphism.
Imagining God in our own image.
Exactly. We project our human limitations onto the divine, we assign it a gender, we give God a posture, and, critically, we project our human emotional turbulence onto it. We say God is jealous or angry or vengeful, just like it's written in some ancient human recorded texts. He uses that great analogy. If you ask a horse what God looks like, he will probably describe a horse.
Right.
Humans, because we want familiarity and control, We imagine the source as this gigantic, idealized version of ourselves, and that process just inherently diminishes the infinite nature of being. He even questions, maybe those powerful figures who supposedly made us in their image were real, but maybe they were the ones struggling with those human emotions, and we just misinterpreted their struggle as being the nature of the source itself.
And he reinforces this critique with this really curious statistical paradox he pulls from the very texts that promote dualism from the Bible.
Yes, the paradox of power. It's undeniable when you look at it. He notes that when you actually tally up the acts of God and the devil in the Bible, God is said to have taken millions of lives, floods, plagues, wars. Meanwhile, the devil is responsible for only a handful, and even those were only with God's explicit permission, like in the story of Job.
So that really challenges the idea of two equal rivals.
It completely undermines it. It suggests that the chaos and suffering we attribute to some external evil force are either, one, part of a much larger incomprehensible plan orchestrated by a single immense power, or two, they're just the natural consequence of human separation and free will. It shows that the dualistic story we use to cope might not be the whole truth.
So if God is not this human-like figure with emotional turbulence and not an external rival, how does Perez ultimately define the source in this book?
He sees God as an essence, something utterly boundless, formless, and fundamental. He defines it as presence, breath, light, the sustaining force behind all things, like the invisible forces of wind or gravity. And then he draws this really fascinating and, I think, necessary parallel to a black hole.
The black hole analogy is, it's a bit jarring at first, but it is incredibly insightful once you sit with it. Why a black hole?
Because a black hole is the ultimate paradox of power and absence. It's the single most powerful force we know of in the universe. It can warp space, time, light itself. And yet, at its core, it's defined by the absence of visible matter. It's the ultimate void.
So the most powerful force is nothing.
Precisely. The most powerful force is the absence of all form. Everything that exists in our material world came from nothing. Creation sprang out of a void. The source is just too vast, too expansive to be contained by human language or perception. So describing it by what it is not, a formless essence, is actually more accurate than trying to define it by any limitation we can dream up.
Okay, so if the source is pure, formless essence or light, then it follows that evil can't be a substance or a rival entity competing with it. It has to be something else. And that's where his definition of evil as absence comes in.
That's the crucial pivot. Evil in this framework isn't a positive substance. It's a negative condition. It's the absence of light, just like darkness is simply the absence of illumination. He reframes the whole concept of sin using this really powerful pedagogical analogy. He asks, when a child can't speak, what do? We immediately recognize a lack of learned language, a lack of skill. We don't call the child inherently stupid or worthless. We understand they're just incomplete in that area.
And the spiritual parallel is?
Similarly, he asks, why do we instantly call a person who is struggling a sinner, wicked, or inherently evil or corrupted? Shouldn't we instead recognize in them a profound lack of spiritual fluency, a disconnection from that sacred self within? Sin, in this view, gets redefined. It's not inherent malevolence, it's spiritual immaturity or incompletion, a failure to align with what is whole and holy. And that naturally leads to actions that cause harm to yourself and to others. It completely changes the conversation from one of judgment to one of compassion and growth.
This new perspective where evil is absence and suffering is potential growth that really helps us reconcile our past struggles. It suggests our judgment of events as bad is often based on an incomplete, really limited human viewpoint.
It connects directly to that famous Steve Jobs commencement speech idea. You can only connect the dots looking back. What we label as bad or evil in the moment is just incomplete from our limited perspective because we can't see the final tapestry that's being woven. Perez cites the powerful example of Oprah Winfrey. She experienced this deep, horrific childhood trauma, including rape. Horrific in the moment. But that trauma became part of the shaping fire that forged her indomitable spirit and led her to her life's work of helping others heal. It compels you to look at suffering not as some cosmic flaw or punishment, but often as an intense, necessary component of something much larger. It becomes the seed of our greatest growth and highest purpose. Life, he suggests, in its mysterious unfolding fullness, is always working toward the greater good, even when our human ego cannot understand the pain of the process.
That profound sense of reconciliation brings us to the path forward. If we recognize this duality and the true nature of the source, how do we shift from being, reactive to truly being responsive? Perez points to silence as the essential tool here.
Silence is the excavation tool. It's what's needed to interrupt the pattern of ego-driven reaction.
Yeah.
We live in a world that is defined by the speed of response. True listening is so rare. Most of us, he notes, are already frantically preparing our reply while the other person is still talking.
We just want to fill the space.
We rush to respond. We lose clarity, we lose wisdom, because silence makes the ego deeply, deeply uncomfortable. The ego equates silence with a lack of control, with vulnerability, and that prompts us to fill every empty gap with noise or explanation or just some distraction.
And by rushing, we miss almost the entire message. We're only getting the most superficial level of communication.
Precisely. We miss the complexity. We're taught what to think and what to say, but not how to process meaning beyond the spoken word. The book highlights that only about 7% of communication is in the actual words. The other 93% is in the nonverbal channels, the tone, the pace, facial expression, posture, all these subtle cues that carry the true emotional cargo.
So the silence creates space for all of that to land.
When you actively choose to pause, when you enforce silence, you allow all those nonverbal layers to land and to register. This creates the essential space for internal clarity to arise, ensuring that your response aligns with the truth inside you, rather than just being a fear-driven reflex or some inherited habit. He stresses that silence must be earned. It's a pearl you have to excavate from the noise.
Once we've excavated that space through silence, the second, and I would argue most important tool for transformation that Perez introduces is focus. He even says, where focus goes, reality unfolds.
Focus is presented as the silent architect of our inner and our outer world. It's the most powerful mechanism for creating a connection with your truest self. The psychological mechanism behind it is both simple and profound. Whatever you habitually focus on seeing, hearing, and feeling, you will inevitably experience more of. It acts as a spiritual and psychological filter that determines what grows in your daily experience, whether that's suffering and lack or blessing and abundance.
This sounds almost too simple, but he grounds it in specific psychology, right? He talks about the Bader-Meinhof effect, the frequency illusion.
It's the perfect, relatable illustration. We have all experienced this. You buy a very specific new model of car, let's say a yellow vintage convertible, and suddenly you see that exact car everywhere you go.
Right. They weren't all hiding before.
The cars didn't just multiply overnight. Your brain simply flagged it as significant. Psychologically, this is your reticular activating system, or RAS. It's your brain's filtering mechanism. It directs your perception to certain streams of data while filtering out the vast majority of other information. The Bader-Meinhof effect proves that your perception literally shapes the reality you experience.
The spiritual application is that we can consciously choose what our brain flags as important in our internal world.
Exactly. If your habitual focus, which is driven by the ego, is on fear, comparison, lack, getting validation, the matters of the flesh, your RAS will filter the world for confirmation of those fears, and that creates profound disconnection. But if you consciously choose to redirect that focus to matters of the spirit, to presence, gratitude, clarity, kindness, your inherent wholeness, the world begins to reflect that back to you. It creates connection. It ignites inspiration. And the beauty of it is that we hold complete dominion over our focus. That consistent, deliberate choice fundamentally shapes the reality we inhabit.
Let's turn the conversation now to what he calls the internal weighing scale, which is this balance between knowledge and faith, framed, of course, within the context of the two within.
Knowledge and faith are the separate tools of the two selves. Knowledge is the tool of the flesh, of the ego. It's stored data. It's accumulated through education, experience, all your learned survival mechanisms, and it is entirely necessary. It's useful for navigating the world of form. It's essential for a surgeon or a pilot.
It's based on the past.
Entirely based on the past. Faith, conversely, is the sacred tool of the spirit. It's that silent whisper, the unseen force that sustains and creates and transcends. It's what allows you to move forward when you lack complete understanding, when the dots can't be connected yet, when you can't see the full picture. Knowledge is about what was. Faith is about what is possible.
He makes a powerful argument that perception isn't just reality, that belief and faith can actively create reality. He links this ancient idea to modern psychological phenomena.
He argues that belief and faith are the root mechanisms that govern the transition of thought into matter. And you can see this in emotional reality, right? Two people in the exact same economic or health situation will create vastly different lived experiences based purely on their underlying worldview, their pessimism or their optimism, which is just a form of belief.
But the most undeniable proof, he argues, comes from the medical world. He points to the placebo and nocebo effects.
They are the scientific demonstration of thought-shaping matter. The placebo effect shows that a sugar pill, when you couple it with the patient's deep belief in its healing power, can actually trigger the body's innate healing chemistry.
And the nocebo effect is the dark side of that.
It's deeply sobering. A negative diagnosis, whether it's true or not, can implant a belief in your mind that leads your body to manifest the expected disease. It causes physical suffering based entirely on an idea. This is thought-shaping matter. This is faith in action, for better or for worse. It suggests that the boundary between the physical and the conceptual is way more porous than we think.
So the pursuit of a deep faith like that often involves grappling with that constant internal friction we call doubt. How does he incorporate doubt into this path, especially since it's usually seen as the opposite of faith?
He just fundamentally reframes doubt. He argues that doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is, counterintuitively, a necessary part of the path to a deeper faith. He sees doubt not as a weakness, but as the beginning of true seeking. The word question, in its ancient sense, meant to seek.
So if you question, you're seeking.
If you question inherited dogma, you're forced to engage with it. You have to uncover all the borrowed beliefs and the inner drama that were never really yours, and that allows them to dissolve. He says he finds it impossible not to question, especially when you study the vast scale of human history versus the relatively short, geographically specific history of modern religions. Doubt, when you embrace it constructively, it forces genuine seeking. And that leads to growth and ultimately to the quiet wisdom of knowing that you truly know very little. And that is the necessary prerequisite for the spirit to step in.
If the ego is the voice of our human experience, then the natural extension of all this questioning is identity. We cling so fiercely to our labels, father, husband, Christian, whatever our profession is. But he argues these are just roles we play. They're not who we are at our core.
That's the truly liberating realization, but it's also the most terrifying one for the ego. These labels, they provide a sense of security and structure, but they are temporary and they're shifting. He acknowledges, he says, I am not a father when my attention is focused intensely on my work. I'm not a husband when I'm being a son. These roles are functional costumes. They dissolve and reappear like waves depending on the context. They do not and they cannot define your eternal, irreducible self.
Why do we cling so tightly to them if they're so fleeting?
We use categories and labels to feel anchored in the material world. When we experience loss, you get fired, a divorce, a parent dies. If we have confused the costume with the actor, the ego collapses, and that leads to an existential crisis. The core truth, the irreducible identity that remains when all the roles are stripped away, is simply, I just am. It's that quiet echo of the divine declaration we talked about earlier. He encourages you to see these roles as assignments to be completed with love, not identities to be possessed and defended.
He illustrates this struggle so well by grappling with his own Christian faith. He values the community, the moral framework, but he refuses to just surrender his reason to the literal text.
This is a major friction point for a lot of readers, and he just tackles it head on. He nates the paradox of loving the shared belief, the community, the familiar verses, but at the same time being unable to ignore the historical reality that the Bible has been translated and edited and revised over 30,000 times. It was shaped by human hands, by rulers, by councils who are serving their own political and institutional interests.
So he doesn't believe divine truth is limited to any one book.
No, and he says clearly he will not surrender his reason or his critical judgment. Instead, he strives to feel whether the words echo from that sacred place within the soul. He cautions that belief itself is a powerful creative force, but when it becomes rigid dogma or a weapon to impose on others, it becomes fundamentally harmful. It becomes an act of separation.
This philosophical questioning leads, of course, to the biggest question of all. What is the meaning of life? He starts by addressing that classic tension between predestination and free will.
And this tension is impossible to resolve logically, which is why Perez just shifts the question entirely. If life is strictly predestined, if every path is already laid out, then free will is an illusion, and our struggle is pointless. On the other hand, if we have absolute, true free will, then there can't be some grand, cosmic, predetermined script that defines our every step.
So he concludes the meaning isn't something that's handed down to us.
Precisely. He suggests the meaning of life may not be something external handed down from the heavens or something you discover in an ancient text. Instead, it's something we are invited, maybe even required, as co-creators, to create for ourselves. If we're made in the image of the Creator, then our highest purpose is to become conscious creators. For him, a deeply satisfying meaning to create is simply to leave this place better than I found it. Meaning becomes an act of choice, a posture you take toward the world, not a destination you find.
The value, then, is not in finding a definitive answer, but in the journey of asking. The questions themselves become the compass.
Absolutely. The endless descent into inquiry is inherently satisfying. The questions act as a compass, guiding you without ever truly requiring a definitive, rigid resolution. He shares that he wrote the book primarily for his sons, urging them to trust that inner voice, the God within, above all the noise of external conditioning and inherited opinion and anxious memory. The soul longs for meaning. It longs for the wisdom that comes not from arriving somewhere, but from walking the road with open eyes and an engaged heart.
Help us visualize this separation between the conditioned ego and the eternal self. Perez uses this extended metaphor in the book. It's his powerful parable of the forgotten self, which he also calls the child within the shell.
This parable is just a masterstroke of analogy. He asks you to imagine being born into utopia, a state of perfection, innocence, complete trust. But suddenly, there's an emergency and you're forced to escape to Mars. To survive this alien environment, you have to be placed inside a mechanical survival suit, a robot, that's engineered entirely for that hostile world.
And your true consciousness.
Your true consciousness, your essential innocence, is put into a slumber. It's dimmed and filtered by this machine, which represents the body and the ego. Over time, the robot evolves to survive, its programming becomes fixed and rigid, and it eventually forgets the precious, pristine being that's inside it entirely.
Wow, the interpretation of that parable is so sobering. It suggests that the performance of being an adult is inherently unnatural and just exhausting.
The adult self is the shell. It's the armor we wear. It's an unnatural performance of composure and strength and fixed identity that leads to anxiety, depression, and profound exhaustion. We are running on the survival programming of the robot. The natural state, which is the child within, is pure, curious, fluid, and unashamed. When a child falls, they just get up and keep moving. They don't process it as failure.
That immediately connects to that ancient wisdom. Be like water.
Yes, Lao Tzu and Bruce Lee's wisdom is intrinsic to this parable. Water doesn't resist, it flows and it adapts. The child, similarly, knows only flow. They rise again after every fall because the concept of judgment, of good and evil, hasn't been fully internalized by the ego yet. The fall from Eden, Perez suggests, wasn't about sin in the traditional sense. It was about gaining dualistic judgment, seeing good and evil, and that introduced separation, guilt, and fear into the human experience. The spiritual journey is the systematic dismantling of the robot suit to free the child within.
The ultimate goal, then, is the return to that essence, the reconciliation of the two within. He wraps this whole segment up by offering his really unique, intimate view of the Trinity, linking it to these internal selves as a final illustration of inner union.
He views the Trinity Father, Son, and Spirit not as three external figures, but as a wholly necessary union that exists within the soul, a profound mirror of our inner world, much like, the three components of a functional computer or a three-part harmony. He sees the Father as the guide, the voice of wisdom, the calm, eternal reason within us that provides direction.
And the Son.
The Son is the innocence we buried and forgot, the wise child within who knows without having to learn. And the Spirit is the connector, the intuition, the breath, the sacred bridge that allows these three distinct facets to flow as one unified presence. It's all about relationship, awareness, and awakening what has always been inside you, regardless of your religious affiliation.
This has been an incredibly deep exploration into the nature of self, identity, and the dissolution of all these external frameworks that trap the ego. The central journey of this entire book, The Two Within, is about dying to that fragmented, seeking self and remembering that the separation between the ego and the spirit was always, at the end of the day, an illusion.
That is the ultimate conclusion that all the signposts in the book point to. God, as Perez argues, is not some figure who sits in judgment. God is being itself, the origin, the foundational intelligence, the mind behind the mind that operates reality. This source doesn't speak in audible syllables or complicated syntax. It speaks in vibration, in frequency, and in profound silence. It's a deeper kind of presence we rarely slow down enough to even notice.
So when we turn inward,
When we turn inward through prayer, meditation, stillness, we're tuning into that omnipresent frequency. The line between God and I becomes completely transparent, because the final, most tenacious illusion to dissolve is the illusion that there was ever any separation at all.
if you found these concepts resonating deeply with that inner whisper, you are invited to continue this journey of remembrance and self-discovery. We really encourage you to pick up the full text of the book, The Two Within, Ego, Spirit, and the Question of Who You Are by Jimmy Perez, to delve deeper into these essential concepts and complete your own breakthrough. You can also explore his other works, I know there's an Adam's journey. If I know better, why am I not doing better? And the Soul University. This is truly a book designed to spark that internal conversation and that necessary friction.
And as you reflect on this deep dive and the profound power of self-responsibility and internal perception that Perez outlines, maybe consider this final provocative thought. It's rooted in that core tension of the two forces battling